All right. I want to welcome everyone back to, where are we? The California Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board. Probably like everyone else on the panel, we've got, right, we've all got 4 or 5 other things going on at the same time. So we'll go over to our next expert panel, have that introduced by board member Ali.
So our next panel is going to focus on law enforcement accountability and the rights of impacted families. You'll be hearing about accountability from many different angles, including the civilian complaint process, internal police department reform, and community policing efforts that we touched on in our earlier panel, and as well as government investigations into law enforcement agencies. You will also hear about the rights of crime victims, which includes folks who are victims of police misconduct and police violence. As discussed before on the panel, the board members will have an opportunity to ask questions at the conclusion of the panel, and we're going to go to public comment after that. We are not going to do the index cards this time around because of time constraints, so if folks have comments, please bring them in the public comment period. And I'm also going to give a brief introduction of each panelist prior to their presentation rather than going into their extended bio. So if you want that, that is on tab 6 of the binder, and if folks in the public want it, please, it's up in the front. Okay, great. So refer to that sheet. So our first panel is Joyce Hicks. She is an attorney, public administrator, and civilian oversight of law enforcement professional who is the former executive director of the San Francisco Office of Civilian Complaints. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on civilian oversight of law enforcement. During my presentation today, I'll just touch briefly on my background, as well as the Oakland Community Police Review Agency, Oakland Police Commission, the San Francisco Police Commission, and San Francisco Department of Police Accountability. It's civilian oversight generally. So just by way of my background, and you have a detailed bio, as was pointed out, I have did serve 14 years as an executive director of the 2 largest civilian oversight of police agencies in the San Francisco Bay Area. In Oakland for 5 years, from 2002 to 2007, and in San Francisco for 9 years, from 2007 to 2017. So I've seen firsthand civilian oversight during the first 20 years of the 21st century. Both the agencies in San Francisco and in Oakland have appointed boards, which are police commissions. This has given me a broad perspective of civilian oversight of the police, and I've seen an evolution of both of those agencies. Oakland, when I went to the Civilian Police Review Board office in 2002, was a very small agency. My experience with that agency had been from the perspective of being a chief assistant city attorney and also a deputy city attorney, the Oakland City Attorney's Office, for over 20 years. The Oakland CPRB, and now it has a different name because the voters in 2016 adopted Measure LL to enhance Oakland's oversight. But the CPRB was the name of both the staff and the board, Citizens Police Review Board. It was created by Oakland City Council resolution, a resolution in 1980. It had the power to make findings on civilian complaints of police misconduct, to propose discipline for officers, and make policy recommendations that it would then in turn recommend to the chief of police. The CPRB staff had seven members, including the director, a designated policy analyst, and investigators. The Citizens Police Review Board itself was a 7-member board that was appointed by the mayor. Staff of the CPRB investigated approximately 100 complaints a year, which it would present to the board for action. If the board made findings of misconduct, the police chief would determine whether to take actions on the findings, and if so, what discipline would be imposed on the officer. So as you can see, it was advisory in nature. The decision-making process was somewhat cumbersome, but it involved the CPRB director, the police chief, and the city administrator. As I alluded to, the voters in Oakland in 2016 adopted ballot measure LL. This ballot measure was put on the ballot by the Oakland City Council, and it amended the Oakland City Charter to create a police commission. So it went from a Citizens Police Review Board to a police commission, which would be run by 7 appointed civilian commissioners. This is an evolution, a huge evolution from the CPRB, which was created, as I said, by City Council resolution. What this police commission, which is now seated, does is it oversees the Oakland Police Department, which was unheard of in Oakland history, and it oversees the Community Police Review Agency. It has the power to investigate complaints of police misconduct, to impose discipline on police officers. It oversees the police department policies and procedures, which are eventually, if determined to be appropriate, adopted by the Oakland City Council. This measure was adopted by 83% of the voters. The Oakland Police Commission nominates the police chief and the CPRB director for appointment by the city administrator. So the city administrator cannot, on her own, nominate a police chief. The city administrator relies on a list that's provided by the police commission, as well as the Community Police Review Agency director. The police commission has the power to terminate the police chief and the CPRA director. So it's a sea change for Oakland to grant a commission the power to terminate a department head, which is a power that had been, in my 30 years as an employee of the city of Oakland, reserved for the mayor, and prior to a charter change, the city manager. What else does a police commission do? It adopts police department policies, such as the police departments, the Oakland police departments. Let me back up a little bit. My apologies. Moving to San Francisco. So San Francisco has a 7-member police commission as well. It is a 7-member appointed board, 4 by the mayor, 4 by the Board of Supervisors. This commission nominates the police chief and the director of the Department of Police Accountability for appointment by the mayor. The office, the Civilian Oversight Office, was called the Office of Citizen Complaints until a ballot measure to amend the San Francisco City Charter, which changed the name from the Office of Citizen Complaints to the Department of Police Accountability. The San Francisco Police Commission sets policy for the police department. It oversees the Department of Police Accountability. So when I retired from my post with the Department of Police Accountability in 2017, in June of last year, the switch had already taken place. It was no longer the Office of Citizen Complaints. It was the Department of Police Accountability. What does the Police Commission do in San Francisco? Again, like in Oakland, it conducts disciplinary hearings on charges of police misconduct that are filed by either the Chief of Police or the Director of the Department of Police Accountability. In San Francisco, the police chief can only impose discipline of up to 10 days suspension. Anything greater than that has to come from the police chief filing charges or the Department of Police Accountability filing charges with the Police Commission. And the Police Commission has the power to impose discipline in cases that warrant it. The Police Commission also hears officer appeals from discipline that's imposed by the Chief of Police. A very key role that the San Francisco Police Commission fills is adopting police department policies, such as department general orders. Examples of some of the policies recently adopted by the Police Commission for the San Francisco Police Department. Beginning in 2015, the San Francisco Police Commission worked for the adoption of a collaborative reform initiative between the San Francisco Police Department, the mayor, and the community-oriented policing services in the Office of the Department of Justice under President Obama's administration. This collaborative reform process was initiated with an MOU signed by the mayor, now the late mayor, Ed Lee of San Francisco, as well as the chief of police, then police of San Francisco Police Department, and Ron Davis, who was the former director of the COPS office. And it, as some might say, is a step before a negotiated settlement agreement or a consent decree where a police department could go to community-oriented policing services, to the Justice Department, to have itself looked at so that it could improve its policies. And generally, some major event has occurred that causes the police department to think we need to look at how we're doing things, we need to work with the community better. And as a result of many officer-involved shootings in San Francisco, the collaborative reform agreement, it was comprehensive. 94 findings and 272 recommendations for changes to the San Francisco Police Department in areas of use of force, hiring, training, investigations of civilian complaints, including the then Office of Citizen Complaints and how it investigated its complaints and communicated those results to the complainants. So now, here we are in 2018 with President Trump's weakening of the jurisdiction of the COPS office. The Collaborative Reform Initiative is no longer overseen through in Washington, D.C., through the Justice Department. Instead, that responsibility has been transferred by the San Francisco Police Commission to the State Attorney General's office, fortunately. So some other policies that the Police Commission has adopted for the police department, and it's not just an adoption from out of the air, so to speak. There's a whole concurrence process that the police department and its unions and its command staff and the Department of Police Accountability go through before police policies are ultimately adopted. But recently, a body-worn camera policy, a policy on how children of arrested parents are treated, a new use of force policy emphasizing the sanctity of life, de-escalation, and officer safety. San Francisco had not amended its use of force policy since 1995. Moving quickly to what does staff do? And this is the former Office of Citizen Complaints, now the Department of Police Accountability. So in 1983, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors placed a ballot measure for adoption to create the Office of Citizen Complaints. It has gone through a series of amendments through ballot measure because it is a charter amendment, can only be amended by a vote of the electorate. The Department of Police Accountability, the name changed to that, and it has the power to audit the police department. It has the duty to audit all officer-involved shootings, how they are handled, as well as how the San Francisco Police Department Internal Affairs Division investigates its complaints. The DPA, that is the Civilian Staff Oversight Agency, investigates all civilian complaints against San Francisco police officers, has the subpoena power, as does the San Francisco Police Commission. The DPA director has the power to make findings after the investigators have investigated and make recommendations on discipline to the chief of police for discipline that would be result in 10 or less days of suspension. However, it is the police chief's ultimate determination for that level of discipline as to whether to agree or not. And then the police commission, again, will take charges from the director of the Department of Police Accountability on matters where the director determines that discipline could result in more than 10 days suspension or any other matters that the director considers to deem importance. A big role that the Department of Police Accountability plays is in making policy recommendations to the police department and to the police commission. The staff at the Department of Police Accountability has developed a practice of working collaboratively with community-based organizations and bringing those community-based organizations and the San Francisco Police Department together to develop policies that would increase the legitimacy of the department, build trust with the community. Some examples would be Department General Orders on children of arrested parents, language access, body-worn cameras, shooting at cars, and key crisis intervention training. The staff also conducts mediation of civilian complaints against officers, and then as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Police Accountability every 2 years must audit the San Francisco Police Department to review its use of force policies and its handling of claims of police misconduct. The DPA director also has the authority to audit any other matters she deems necessary. Moving away from the specifics, civilian oversight models. Many cities have established civilian oversight agencies or processes so that they have an independent citizen oversight board or civilian oversight board that reviews complaints of misconduct. But it can range. Civilian oversight can range from agencies and boards with limited authority to agency and boards that have investigative powers, subpoena powers, audit powers, mediation powers. Each community establishes its own local parameters. I'm going to just move quickly to transparency and accountability. A frustration for civilian oversight is California law and how it denies the public access to critical information about how law enforcement agencies investigate officers who violate the law or department rules. Departments are forbidden from sharing factual findings in investigations into police shootings. Lessons learned. Body-worn cameras are important tools for investigating officer conduct, but they're only as good as a police department's policy governing them and officers' compliance with the policy. Discipline, it's an essential piece of police accountability, but it generally only impacts a small percentage of the department. It's not enough to change policies, and that's where civilian oversight can make a huge difference in recommending policy changes. Officers must be trained on these policies, supervised, and have ongoing implementation review of them. To create a change in culture in law enforcement, agency leadership must ensure that policies reflect fair and impartial policing, de-escalation of force, highlight the sanctity of human life without compromising officer safety. That concludes my remarks. You're welcome.
Our second panelist is Chief Alwyn Brown, the Chief of the Richmond Police Department. He served as the Richmond Police Department, he served the Richmond Police Department since 1984 and has worked with the United States Department of Justice on several pattern and practice investigations. So we'll hand it over to you, Chief.
So good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Richmond and the Richmond Police Department because I've had a position there as a sworn police officer for a long time, and I have a footprint in 4 decades. So I think I can speak firsthand to the evolution that is still in progress in Richmond. So we do have a priority in being connected to evidence-based practices, modern technology tools, all those things that help us work a little bit smarter, more efficiently, and keep pace with the changes in the communities that we serve in Richmond. So Richmond is in the Bay Area, East Bay City of about 110,000, north of Berkeley. We have a presence on San Francisco Bay, about 32 miles of bay shoreline, home of the Richmond Chevron refinery, and known for building World War II ships in the 1940s. The population is diverse. The geographic footprint is a little unique in that all of it is not contiguous, so it stretches over 56 square miles. It's about 30 land miles to cover, but that lends itself to Richmond having really different neighborhoods. So we've mostly been known in terms of crime for a handful of persistent pockets where the usual variables have persisted for generations. That's poverty, generational repeat offending, lower education, schools not really serving the needs of those populations. We also have, homes on the bay where people park their yachts in the backyard. So it really spans the spectrum. So it really does call for sort of a broad approach. So we believe, and I think we've demonstrated over time, that foundational to everything that we do really is good, productive, and continuing police and community relationships and dialogue. Whether we agree or disagree, we have to stay connected. So policing really is built around 2 purposes in a democracy: prevent crime, maintain order. Everything that we do flows from that. And we try to take a prevention approach or have a prevention emphasis on everything that we do. So community policing in sort of the academic context is problem solving, community engagement, and organizational transformations. I mean, it's an old concept from the 80s, but it's what everybody tries to practice. But you have to, tailor fit this stuff to your unique environment, locality, workforce, community. And the trickiest variable is the organizational transformation, because there's not really a textbook on exactly what that looks like and what it entails. But we think we've gotten to a place where we have a decent mix of stuff that seems to work. So community policing is what we're more known for today. In the 1980s, what we're known for is being the police department agency that had paid out the largest judgments in lawsuits over police-involved shooting deaths. So it's a really different place today. So our community policing approach involves really neighborhood policing, dividing the city geographically into 3 districts. There's command over each district and sort of the traditional hierarchy, ladder of command that police departments are known for. And then at the beat level, officers are assigned to deal with calls for services, but those officers have to balance 2 equally important responsibilities. So they do have to be ready emergency responders, but they also have to be invested. They have to be problem solvers. They have to work, with beat officers, with others in the organization to solve problems based on how community prioritizes that. So that's a difficult balance to strike exactly the same way all the time. It's always different, but we've been at it for a while, and so we feel like we can get it accomplished on most days. The organizational transformation part of it in Richmond is really about collaborative leadership at the top. So the leadership team, from me and my top commanders, we work together. We brainstorm constantly. One layer on sort of our mix of people, practices, tech tools, strategies, and approaches is a crime accountability system where we do meet monthly. They meet more like twice a month, really just to focus on crimes in their areas of responsibility and prioritizing how resources are used to address those. Part of the cross-function collaboration is built into the structure. So those commanders have sort of overlapping responsibilities, which means that they have to work together because they share resources that have to be used to deal with most every problem. That's not that easy to do, to sort of layer a sort of a matrix cooperative system over a traditional sort of a top-down hierarchy, but it's how you blow up the silos, and it's easier to get than folks at lower levels in specialized functions to work across those functions, to shift on the fly to address emerging problems in Richmond. And again, Richmond is a place that really has been known for those persistent pockets, especially public gun violence and shootings that rival the most dangerous and deadly any place in the country. So we've been able to have some impact across sort of the crime spectrum just in working together and working with communities. But it's really been the mix. So, but it's not just that. I mean, you have to have a robust check and balance system. I think we have a mix of things that help us, keep cops focused on what's expected of them and of doing their jobs and doing them well and doing them correctly and being able to intervene when things sort of get colored outside the lines. So one of the features as it relates to just misconduct in general is our Office of Professional Accountability model. So it's, sort of a modern adaptation of an internal affairs office, but it's not housed at police headquarters. It's located at City Hall downtown, and intentionally, to tear down any invisible barriers that might exist for folks to take complaints about service or misconduct. And it's run by a civilian manager who's also an attorney, and they do those investigations. And it also offers mediation. So for lower level complaints where people feel like they were disrespected or discourteous, those are some of the kinds of complaints that can be mediated through the Office of Professional Accountability. And then in Richmond for 30 years or so, we've had civilian oversight. It's our Citizens Police Review Commission. They can accept complaints on officer use of force, racially abusive treatment, and they also make policy recommendations to me for the police department. When it comes to using force, we have multiple layers of review internally. So every use of force is investigated by a first-line supervisor, and then it goes to the next level, lieutenant. And then every use of force on a monthly basis is reviewed by a committee. So we do pay attention and look at the data and how much force is used or how often it's used. But every incident gets a broader review on a monthly basis. And that allows us the opportunity to ensure that force is being used within proportion to what the officer is facing. But it also allows us to address any lapse of training or training issues that might exist and or the misapplication of a particular tool that an officer may be using so we can address those issues proactively and with training. Policy is the other intersection, strong policy related to use of force. And then our officers have been equipped with body-worn cameras since 2015, and that footage gets regular audit to make sure that people are doing their jobs the way that they're supposed to. But really, I think what we've been successful in doing is transforming the culture of the organization. Clearly, that starts with who you hire. People who want to help others, who have that sense of service before self, who feel comfortable in their own skin, who can relate to different kinds of people very naturally, and who want to do some problem solving and work with community. And the nice thing about building that reputation is, so that's kind of who we attract. So the community in Richmond, the population is majority minority, and so is the police force at about 60-40. And so this is, sort of a journey for us, work in progress. We tinker with it, on a regular basis. We just had an outside analysis by the Department of Justice. The Office of Justice Programs has a small office called the Diagnostic Center, where they I asked them to come in and look at two things. Our sort of community policing approach and what that looks like, what works and why, and to also look at how we address gun violence in Richmond. It's been a problem for decades, and give us an evaluation. And so based on some of those recommendations, we have an informed roadmap to go forward and to tinker some more. So one other sort of worst to improvement is around homicides. I mean, so the majority of murders that have occurred historically in Richmond have been accomplished with a firearm, usually a public shooting or something, over any number of beefs or disagreements and some long-standing rivalries in the city. So for our small community, 1991 was the highest year. There were 61 murders in the city. Last year we had 15, and they always tell me not to talk about this, but to date this year we've had 6, so it's work in progress. And so that, kind of in a nutshell, is our approach to policing Richmond, covering community and sort of the internal processes.
Thank you, Chief Brown. Our next panelist is going to join us via video conference. Professor Christy Lopez. She's a distinguished visiting professor at Georgetown Law and served as the deputy chief in the special litigation section of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. Thank you, Professor Lopez, excuse me.
Justice investigations and his knowledge of policing and his willingness to tackle the most difficult issues in policing is really profound and really helpful. And then, of course, Kelly Evans, one of the best lawyers and the best people you'll ever meet. And I'm just very jealous that all of you get to work with all of them so much more often than I do. So with that, I'm going to take a step back a bit and give you a bit of a 60,000-foot view that will probably be nothing earth-shattering, but perhaps the best way to think about it is some organizing principles that I think, based on my 20-plus years working in the field of police accountability, are useful. Whatever particular approach to accountability you're talking about, whatever mechanism you're thinking about putting in place. So I want to first sort of lay the marker down for what we mean when we talk about accountability. And I think that it's useful to think about accountability as that the aim of accountability is that we're trying to create a culture of accountability where conducting oneself with integrity is the norm rather than hit or miss or the exception. And those exceptional incidents of misconduct are responded to effectively. So that's when I think about accountability, I'm really thinking about trying to create, how do you create that culture? create such a culture, you have to have a comprehensive approach to accountability, and that includes both considering front end and back end accountability. By front end, I mean you need mechanisms that are in place that are going to prevent problems, are going to prevent misconduct, and you need the back end mechanisms that will help you respond to and detect problems. So that comprehensive approach requires that accountability is reflected in all of an agency's systems. It has to be reflected in its policies, in its training, and in its what Kelly and I used to call actual practice. Actual practice means that accountability is reflected in and supported by everyday supervision, by performance assessments, by promotional decisions, and through robust formal accountability systems. And those accountability systems, whatever form they take, will include systems to formally conduct administrative investigations of allegations of misconduct. They'll include mechanisms to effectively refer more serious allegations of misconduct for criminal investigation and, where appropriate, prosecution. And they're going to reflect coordination with outside oversight entities. Again, whether that's front-end or back-end oversight. So that's the first thing, is to make sure that the entire system reflects the accountability commitment of the agency. The second is that it's important that the accountability systems be seen as legitimate, both inside and outside the agency. And to ensure that those accountability systems are seen as legitimate, rather than, for example, as sort of political cover or just a box to be checked, but to be seen as legitimate, there are a few things I think that you need to be mindful of, that an agency needs to be mindful of. One is that the rules cannot be at odds with the agency's mission or strategy or tactics. And what I mean by that is, if you have a rule or you have a accountability ethos that says we will respect people, we will treat people with respect when we're out policing, but you're using tactics that are humiliating people on a daily basis, that accountability structure is not going to be effective. It's not going to have legitimacy, even in your own department, and certainly not in the communities you're policing. And this is tricky, right? Because there are a lot of different people who are involved in choosing the tactics and the strategies of a law enforcement agency, and not very many of them are also involved in making sure the accountability systems work. So you really have to make sure you get those different sets of people together to make this piece of it work. The accountability processes and penalties have to be fair and consistent. That requires transparency. That requires input from all stakeholders. It requires that penalties be neither too lenient nor too harsh. And it requires a recognition that the relative penalties are going to send a message about what the agency and the community, to some extent, thinks is important. So, for example, if an officer gets time off for a uniform infraction, but can use excessive force against somebody with a slap on the hand, then that's going to send a message to everyone involved. And then, of course, the process has to be timely and have appropriate due process provisions. And I really want to underscore due process. This is where it's useful to get community members and lawyers involved. It's important that for legitimacy that there be due process, but remember that administrative investigations are not criminal investigations, they're not criminal prosecutions, and the process that is due is different. If you aren't mindful of that, then it's very easy to allow some administrative investigations to get bogged down for too long, for unnecessarily so. It's also quite helpful if officers trust the intentions of those administering the accountability systems, which in some ways is just another way of saying that police legitimacy is internally relevant as well as externally relevant. Officers need to know that their leaders are holding them accountable to uphold the honor of the profession, to protect the officers' careers, to live up to the standards of policing and to protect the community, not because they just need a fall person or because they don't want to take responsibility themselves. You will always have officers who just aren't going to be with the program and aren't going to believe that any form of accountability is important. But I have seen it make a big difference when officers really trust the integrity of their own leaders in meting out discipline. And I sort of related to all of that, or underscoring all of that, is the importance of remembering that the most effective accountability systems don't rely on the formal mechanism part. They do, to create that culture. That IA office is going to be important. That criminal referral is going to be important, but the overall culture of accountability is going to be most important. And so the accountability mechanisms are absolutely necessary. The formal accountability mechanisms are absolutely necessary for effective culture of accountability, but they are certainly not sufficient on their own to create that culture. And with that, I'll close, and I'm happy to take any questions if people have any. Thank you.
Do you have time constraints, or are you able to stay through the end so people can wait?
I can stay.
Okay, awesome. So we'll save questions for the end then. Thank you. Our final panelist is Roxana Altholz, the Associate Director of the International Human Rights Clinic at UC Berkeley School of Law. She is an international human rights attorney and scholar. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I don't know if I'm able to use the slides. Wonderful. I wanted to thank the organizers for including a human rights attorney on this panel. I think my most relevant experience is over the last 20 years, I've represented victims of state violence, mostly in Latin America, in international litigation. The last few years I've been involved in litigation in federal court, seeking to assert my clients' rights as crime victims of international narcotics conspiracies. And currently I'm working on a study looking at the impact of unsolved murder in Oakland. So about 70 to 80% of homicides in Oakland go unsolved every year. And I'm looking at the impact of that on families, mostly African-American families in Oakland. So I remember in the weeks, so most of my experience as a human rights attorney has been working obviously with victims and working within victim movements. Thank you. And I remember in the weeks following Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, reading an article by a prominent U.S. victims' rights advocate and a former judge that asked the question, is Michael Brown the quote-unquote victim of a crime? The article was taking on a legal question, and a significant one. If Michael Brown was a victim of a crime, his family was entitled to rights under federal and state law and services as crime victims. So today, I'm not going to talk about civil suits, so I'm not going to talk about litigating cases, victims litigating cases to try to obtain monetary compensation. I'm only going to talk about cases, criminal cases, where crime victims try to intervene or obtain services. And I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the history of the crime victims' rights movement in the United States, and the rights and government support afforded to crime victims, particularly in California. And lastly, the structural barriers that prevent victims of police violence from vindicating their rights as crime victims. And I'm going to offer some observations about that from my international experience working in conflict areas. So the history of crime victims, I have to learn how to work this, okay. A recent article that appeared in the New Yorker on the crime victims' rights movement in the United States called the movement the child of an unlikely marriage of conservatism and feminism. So the crime victims' rights movement in the United States has its roots in the efforts by women's rights activists in the 1960s to secure respectful treatment of the victims of rape and sexual assault by law enforcement and courts, but also has its roots in the efforts of law and order conservatives to protest what was known as the due process revolution, which they claimed afforded led to the rights of the accused becoming more important than the rights of the victims in our courtrooms. For the first 4 decades of the victims' rights movement in the United States, the debate was really centered on whether victims should participate in the criminal justice system at all. During the last 35 years, legislation, state constitutional amendments, judicial decisions have all expanded crime victims' rights to participate in criminal proceedings. Currently, all states statutorily protect victims' rights, and 33 states have passed constitutional amendments recognizing crime victims' rights. Victims have the legal right to information about criminal proceedings and the outcome, the opportunity to participate in the proceedings, the right to fair and respectful treatment, and the right to economic restitution. The debate has really changed in the United States. Today, the debate is centered on how victims should participate, not whether they should participate. California, in the last 50 years, has really been at the forefront of the crime victims' rights movement. California created the first victim compensation program in the country in 1965. The Bay Area was where one of the first 3 victim assistance programs was created in 1972. The first victim impact statement was presented to a court in Fresno in 1976, and California was the first state to amend its constitution to address the interests of crime victims by establishing a constitutional right to restitution. And then in 2008, Marsy's Law was approved by ballot measure. And this is a law that protects and expands the legal rights of crime victims to include 17 rights in the judicial process. A person who suffers direct or threatened physical, psychological, or financial harm as a result of the commission of a crime, that's the definition of a crime victim, according to California's Constitution, has these rights. The victims' rights in California are enforceable once law enforcement and prosecutors become aware of the crime victim and remain enforceable through parole and beyond in the case of restitution. Law enforcement and prosecutors are required by law to notify victims of their rights at the time of initial contact with crime victims, during follow-up investigations, and that obligation extends to investigating officers and prosecutors. Officers are supposed to provide victims with Marsy's cards, which are these cards that enumerate these rights. Most rights are not enforceable unless there is a prosecution, such as the right to be notified of public court proceedings. Obviously, if there are no public court proceedings, that right doesn't apply, and the right to restitution doesn't apply if there's no conviction. And I'll come back to that. It's very relevant for the rights of victims of police violence. In addition to these rights, California has a very robust compensation system that pays for services. This graph is from 2012-2013, where $62 million were paid out in services for victims, crime victims, services including mental health services, loss support and income, funeral and burial expenses, home security upgrades, and child care services when a caregiver is killed or disabled because of a crime. The California Victim Compensation Program, or CalVCP as it's known, can provide compensation to victims of state or federal crimes and their family members, regardless of whether the crime has been investigated or prosecuted. And that's also an important point that I'll come back to later. Now, also, there's a federal law called the Crime Victims' Rights Act, or CVRA, that was passed in 2004, that also protects affords crime victims a series of rights. So before talking about the applicability of this regime to victims of police violence, I want to just talk a little bit about, who benefits from these rights and services. And I think the first question to ask is, who are the victims of crimes in California? And here are some statistics. 1 in 5 Californians have been a victim of crime in the last 5 years. Half were the victims of a violent crime. 2 to 3 of these crime victims have been victims of multiple crimes. African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be the victims of crimes, 3 or more crimes in the past 5 years. Victims of violent crimes are more likely to be low-income, young, and African American and Latino. And then we can get to the question of who uses the rights and services. Only 20% of crime victims are even aware that restitution exists as a right, and only 4% of victims' needs are addressed by the current system, and Latinos and African Americans are most likely to have unmet needs. So, with the help of some fabulous researchers at the law school, I've been trying for the last couple weeks to determine through research, so looking at jurisprudence and case law and news reports, whether a victim of lethal use of force or their families more precisely, has ever asserted their rights as crime victims, and we could not find a single case. Not just in California, but in the nation. The only case we were able to find was victim impact statements from victims of sexual abuse, rape by a police officer. So why is that? So I'd like to offer some thoughts. First, level of unfamiliarity, not knowing that the rights and services exist. That is a reoccurring problem. Second, because in most of these cases, no charges are brought. So one recent report concluded that charges were brought only in 2% of on-duty killings committed by law enforcement between 2005 and 2011. And if we go back to this slide, you see that most of these rights are not enforceable during the pre-charge stage, although some are. Another issue I think that's important to highlight is the fact that our laws really divide our population in two binary categories: victim or offender. Now, I've spent the last 2 years interviewing family members of homicide victims in Oakland, and I've interviewed a father in particular comes to mind, who asked the government for support when his son was killed. And the government was providing about $5,000 to $7,500 in burial expenses, funeral expenses. He was not able to afford to bury his son. And he was denied that support because he was on probation. So, and that's under the law. Victims' rights, individuals who are in custody or who are on parole or probation or under community supervision are not eligible for victims' rights and services. And when we live with over-policed communities, particularly communities of color, that excludes them from this kind of support. Also, the Compensation Board takes into account, is heavily influenced by law enforcement determination. So if law enforcement determines that the victim or the family didn't cooperate in the investigation, they can be excluded. If law enforcement determines that the victim or the family contributed to the events that led to the crime, that can be excluded. So in my study, what we're seeing is many young men in Oakland are armed to protect themselves. And if a gun is found in their possession at the time of their death, regardless of whether the gun was part of the crime, they're excluded from rights and services. And then, in my own work as a litigant, what I've seen, I'm currently working on a case involving a death at the border by federal law enforcement. The family member of my clients was tased and beaten to death on video. But in the police reports, he's listed as the perpetrator and the officers are listed as the victims. So this again would exclude his family from services and support. So I want to go back to the question. Are victims of lethal use of force crime victims? I think, so this question was posed to the San Diego's DA, and I wanted to read what her response was. With officer-involved shootings, there is a legal definition of victim. Under the law, we follow those legal definitions. And under Marcy's rights, you have to find that somebody is a victim of a crime. That means a homicide assault was committed against them. It's not going to matter to the family members whether I find that the shooting was justified in terms of not being a crime, a homicide. They still lost a loved one, and we do our best, although they don't have the same rights under Marcy's law that are provided. So I spent about 7 years litigating crime victims' rights in D.C. and New York, in the Southern District. And I think she's wrong on the law. I think that pre-charge, until a determination is made about whether the use of force is justified, victims of police violence do have rights as crime victims. I also just think she's wrong on the political question. In my 20 years of experience litigating cases on behalf of victims of state violence has a different dimension. It doesn't just cause emotional, financial, physical harm. It really fractures the relationship between the victim, their families, and the state. It undermines their very sense of belonging, of citizenship. So I think this is an area that I have been interested as a litigant in challenging. And luckily the laws provide an opportunity to challenge some of these determinations. It's very unusual under federal law. The Crime Victims' Rights Act allows a crime victim to move in federal district court for an order enforcing his or her rights. If denied that order, it can be appealed through a writ of mandamus, and the appeals court has 72 hours to take the writ. So to decide, and that's very unusual to have that kind of very quick turnaround on these kinds of legal appeals. So I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Board members, your questions?
Yes, I have a question for Ms. Hicks, Ms. Ricks. Regarding those commissions that you talked about, have you determined a difference between those who have subpoena power and those commissions that don't have subpoena power, and how effective they are?
Only, and thank you for the question, I've determined it only based on my personal experience, both in San Francisco and in Oakland. The boards or the commissions, as well as the agencies, the staff that serve them had and have subpoena power, which to subpoena outside witnesses, as well as to compel officers to attend interviews and to tell those and to give their interviews truthfully. Agencies, of course, I've learned through my activities with the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, on whose board I sat in the past, that agencies without subpoena power have difficulty with officer cooperation. These are external agencies. Of course, if it's an internal affairs division, then it's insubordination to the chief of police if an officer doesn't attend an IAD interview. However, even with subpoena power or the right to compel officers to come to civilian agencies, there are delaying tactics that have occurred. And it really matters that the director of the Civilian Oversight Agency and the police chief have a relationship where the police chief supports the right of the agency to compel.
One other quick question. These boards that you talked about, are those paid positions or unpaid?
They're unpaid positions. They're city boards and commissions. They might get parking paid, but it is.
Right. I see a problem that deters a lot of individuals who may not have the financial resources from serving on those boards, because from what you're telling us, it sounds like it's very intensive, that to do a good job, you would have to spend some substantial time to do a good job other than just a cursory review of complaints. And for individuals not to be compensated for that, you can only get those folks who have substantial resources to serve on such boards, and they may not have the same type of life experiences as those who may be activists who would want to serve but could not afford to spend the time to do that.
As for Professor Altholz, so is the premise of your research, if an officer is being assaulted and they use deadly force, that the person assaulting them is a victim?
Well, I would assume that in order to determine whether the officer used reasonable force, there would have to be an investigation. And so the question is, during that investigation, whether the victim's family members, because the victim is now deceased, should be able to avail themselves of rights and services. I think the question about services is a bit clearer, because the California VCP does have the authority to provide services even if no charges are brought. But under Marcy's law, until there's a determination made on the investigation, so pre-charge, I think that the law does require the state to recognize them as victims. And this has been the position of some of the most important legal scholars on this matter.
I think with regard to many of the points raised by our speakers, and I thank you very much, it's important that as the board takes into account the points raised by all of you, that what we're asking peace officers to do is support, perhaps at the cost of their lives sometimes, a system that, notwithstanding the existence of constitutional and statutory protections for citizens and non-citizens alike, is still greatly handicapped by systemic injustice. And that is something that, if we don't keep in mind as we take into account the progress that's been made by all of you and people like you, what we have to keep in mind is that we have a systemic set of injustices that not only put peace officers' lives sometimes at risk, but far too often, the lives of citizens. And I'd like to hear from you, if indeed you agree, what your comments are with regard to that.
Yes, thank you for the good observation. So I think that it is important to understand the history of policing in America and to recognize that, yeah, there have been some systemic injustices definitely over history. but I think it also requires a pledge to do better going forward. And I don't know that, we ever achieve a state of mission accomplished, but I think that some improvements can be made, and some improvements have been made. Definitely some improvements are yet to be achieved. It's always really complicated and difficult because, we're dealing with people. We're dealing with human beings. And so some of the earlier points about systems really revolve around who's in the system, so people, what the policies are, how they apply. And a big part of this too is how engaged, how educated, how empowered communities that are policed, how they feel, how they know how the system is supposed to work, how policing is supposed to work, how they can access police services, how they can play their role in prevention and preventing stuff before it happens, which means that, there's some things that they can learn from police. And when you have a good relationship where information goes in both directions, I think you make incremental progress getting there. But none of these communities, neighborhoods, society's not static. It's changing, it's moving, it's shifting. And so governments are always the slowest. But, we have to learn to be more agile and more adaptive, I think. So I think that's a great question. I know that officer, use of force is important because sometimes that results in a loss of life. So I'm just going to recognize that aspects of policing can be extremely dangerous. And, measuring proportionality in the moment is probably really, really difficult to do. But in hindsight, a lot of lessons can be learned, and that's a lot of what we do is we look at situations where stuff went the best that it could. I'm not even going to use the word white, but the best that it could. And in situations where things probably could have been done a lot better. And then, we look to improve going forward. I think, we're up against some challenges. There's 18,000 different police departments in the country. State by state, the training standards, hiring standards are not the same. California's a leader in training standards, but even in being a leader, we're still dealing with people. And here's another honest truth, is that the job can be a real grind, and it changes everybody who signs up to join and to serve. And over time, some people get to a place where they're just not fit to serve anymore. That's just the human reality. But those systems that we talked about should help be early identifiers, either to get those folks to health, wellness, mental health check-in services that they need, or to help sort of get them to a place where they can make a different career choice. So things like peer counseling, which I didn't mention, but we've had at my place for a long time, and check-ins with folks help to keep them on track and to keep them healthy, doing a good job. So I could go on and on, but I'll defer.
I have several questions for Chief Brown, but I should disclose that I spent a large part of my career in the same jurisdiction as Chief Brown, and have asked him questions on the stand before.
A really, really, really long time ago.
So, and I really do appreciate you being here, and I am kind of glad that you are where you are now in that department, having watched that department from the mid-'80s through 2010 when I left and went to Solano. But because Richmond really is as you stated earlier, a microcosm of the country, and at one point in the early 90s had the highest homicide rate in, I think, per capita in the nation.
Top 2.
And I had many of those clients. So my first question is, did the Department of Justice analysis, the evaluation that they did of the Richmond Police Department, was that made public?
It's available on their website, and it is the Office of Justice Programs. I don't have the website in front of me, but if you go to the Office of Justice Programs, the Diagnostic Center, there's a link available to the report. It is public.
Okay. And then would you say that there is a relationship between the reduction of violence and homicides in the city of Richmond, based on the personnel in the Richmond Police Department?
Well, absolutely. I think it's based on a number of things, and what measure of each one is hard to really quantify. But the people who do the work and building trust, and then the willingness of people, of residents, to come forward and to participate in a criminal investigation when a crime does occur. So, I mean, it was pretty common, to have a street shooting and a crowd of people and nobody saw or knew anything and nobody was talking to anybody. That's completely flipped around. It doesn't matter the neighborhood. I mean, now folks are more willing to go on the record and or provide information off the record. We take it either way. But when we do a canvass, when we knock on the door, they open the door and they talk. They just do. And that's a function of trust. That's not an overnight thing. Kind of a long slog to get there. But definitely the people that do the work do matter.
And then, sorry, just what kind of internal audits in the Richmond Police Department exist on use of force by the officers that are currently employed?
So every time a police officer uses force, a supervisor, sergeant has to go to the scene to do the initial investigation and document that. The documentation then goes to the next level of a manager who looks at it, and if it seems on the face, mostly within policy and all right, that moves forward. And it goes into our internal system to be collected monthly. So every use of force on a monthly basis, the actual details of what happened and sort of unpacking the scenario happens in front of a committee. And they look at each one. If they find problems, then it can go a number of places. If it's strictly training or equipment, that's an internal administrative function. If it looks like there could be a potential policy violation, then it can go to the Office of Professional Accountability for an internal investigation to find the facts so that the appropriate corrective action can be taken. Or if it's, policy, then we take a look at the policy and see maybe an aspect of policy could be outdated or maybe it was misapplied. We take a look at the wording of the policy to make sure it's still relevant. So that's the system internally, but every police accountability system, and this is what I like to tell the folks in Richmond, it starts with the people. Those are the eyes and the ears. Most of what a police officer's job is occurs in public spaces. Today anymore, everybody's got, surveillance on their home, cameras, video phones. I mean, it starts there. And if you feel like, an officer was operating, outside the boundaries of their job, then actually you have an obligation to bring that forward and make a complaint. I mean, it really starts there. And then the next level is strong supervision. I really don't like to use buzzwords that much, but supervisors have a responsibility to make sure that the people who report to them are doing their jobs correctly. They refer to that as accountability. And then every layer above that, has a broader responsibility, to make sure that folks are doing their job. And if interventions are necessary, if people are engaged at every level of the organization, when interventions are necessary, hopefully they happen at a lower level so that things don't snowball and get bigger. That's kind of really what an accountability system is all about, but it does start with the public. The power really is with the people.
Thank you.
Reverend, you have a question?
I know we're a little short of time, but I just didn't know both, when you referenced this notion of grinding down, and I know Richmond has been a real good example of community police partnership work with respect to reducing violence with the Office of Neighborhood Safety, along with the Richmond Police, and going, I think it was a year or two without officer-involved killing. There was a couple years back. I don't want to misquote, but the question that I was going to ask, and it could be to the chief, also could be to Dr. Lopez or others interested in best practices. You mentioned this idea of the job grinding people down. It reminded me of something one of our colleagues, Dean Esserman, said. We were in Birmingham earlier this year, and he said that the 30, 40 years in policing from Providence, New Haven, NYPD, said that the job of policing grinds down everything that a human being is, from their race, their religion, even their gender, he said, and leaves people as a police officer. My question around accountability is, are there any mechanisms in place or best practices that are happening across the nation that help us analyze this grinding that's happening and ensuring that we're finding out when people are losing their ability to really provide good public service before people are dead or well, become a danger. So I don't know if there's best practice that Dr. Lopez would know or others, esteemed experts in the field, or even just some practical norms that the chief would have.
I think a lot of the best practices in that area are centered around what we refer to often as officer wellness. And in a way that's unfortunate because there is, although the stigma around sort of mental well-being is much less than it used to be, it's still fairly strong, particularly in most of the policing venues I go to and talk with police officers. But that is something that police departments, if you're, and I think it's an excellent point and an excellent question, because we can have all the systems in place, but policing is a very hard job, and if we aren't spotting the people who are in trouble, then we're going to miss that. So a lot is officer wellness. Another huge piece, and what I would consider is a best practice, is a program is the most active program I know of in this area is in New Orleans. It's called EPIC, Ethical Policing is Courageous, and it's a peer intervention program. They actually teach officers what words to use, how to intervene when they see another officer about to lose it in a particular situation. And you now have officers walking around New Orleans saying, "Hey, I just got EPIC'd," or "Hey, did you see me have to EPIC that person?" So, for example, during the recent protests about the Confederate monuments, there was an African-American officer standing in front of one of the monuments, sort of holding the line, and people were in his face screaming racial epithets with him. And his colleague next to him could see him, over the course of several minutes, about to lose it, and said, "Hey, let me step in," or, "Hey, Sergeant says I don't remember exactly what it was, but some of the phrases are like, Sergeant says he wants to talk to you," or "Why don't you take a break?" And just actually making that part of the culture and training officers quite specifically how you do that. Remember, many officers are quite young and they've not had the opportunity to learn those skills perhaps before becoming a police officer, has had some really profound impacts in New Orleans, for example. And the third thing I'll say is I think an emerging best practice is offering officers support mechanisms from the moment they first begin. So, for example, in Washington, D.C., we have a program called Police for Tomorrow that Georgetown has started with the Metropolitan Police Department. And we took officers while they were still in the academy, and they're in an 18-month program that includes monthly workshops on a lot of different topics, from implicit bias to juvenile brain development, to homelessness in Washington, D.C. But one of the components that's really significant is that they come together monthly for these workshops, and those have become, for want of a better term, support groups for those officers, and they talk about times that they've had as brand new officers among peers where they've had difficulty with other officers, or how do I deal with the situation with another officer? How do I deal with the way I'm feeling right now? And it's been remarkable the way that they will open up with each other. And so I think more opportunities like that to recognize the humanity of these officers and the difficulty. And we felt it was important to start while they were still in the academy, because becoming jaded happens almost immediately. That process happens almost immediately when they begin working.
Yeah, and if I could just add to it. So peer support, a lot of police agencies have them, but we have an active peer support team at the RPD. Police officers experience the worst day in somebody else's life every day, sometimes multiple times a day, but really reluctant because they're supposed to be the helpers to raise their hand when they need some help. So we've had it for a number of years, and we've evolved it. And so now, certain critical incidents that are particularly noteworthy, we just activate the team, and we require folks to come and have several sessions. And that's been particularly helpful. We had Rashonda Franklin, who was a domestic violence victim of a gun murder by her estranged boyfriend, killed her in front of her two small children in a car, in Richmond. And the officers that had to work that scene were pretty devastated by that. And the peer support was the first layer activated right away, along with every other response that we have with investigators and whatnot, just to help those officers kind of unpack that and sort of deal with the stress and the trauma that they're experiencing and having to investigate and deal with that incident. So that's something that didn't exist in my early days of policing, but it's something today that's definitely necessary. And then there's other layers beyond that, but we find that if we activate it from the top, if it's our decision, then folks can't really opt out.
All right, well, thank you so much to this wonderful panel for sharing your expertise. It was really helpful. Yeah, I think one more time, yeah.
Great. I just want to ask the panel about how important it is to have local community involvement with the trainings for the officers.
So we have what we call a Community Safety Academy that we started 2 years ago in Richmond, and it really was designed for two purposes. I mean, the first is to teach residents, it's voluntary, about stuff they can do in terms of crime prevention, stuff they can do to make it less likely that they're victimized when they're in public spaces, what the reporting responsibility is, how to connect up with neighborhood watch groups, neighborhood councils, see something, say something, report suspicious activity to police and get to know their neighbors. And then the other half of it is they get a behind-the-scenes look at how we operate, how we do our jobs, and a big portion of that, probably a portion that moves a lot of people, is we put them through scenarios involving use of force. So we train probably above average on firearms and use of force, and we do different things, including scenario-based training. And it's always an eye-opening experience when people are confronted with having to make a decision in a split second and try to get it right. And so I think that helps, our communities at least have a deeper understanding, of what some of the job is about. At the same time, they've been empowered to sort of go out and help with the overall effort that's everybody's responsibility to prevent crime. And then, of course, when they finish the program, they are community safety ambassadors.
Sorry, just 30 seconds. We have to move to public comment.
I have a point of order, essentially, is that under the Bagley-Keene Act, the requirement for the agenda is not, the content that is on there is to provide complete notice to the public, but the times are just approximate. So while it is better, I know, for people's flights and schedules, you can run over past the 2:30 mark if need be. I just wanted to make sure that was known to everyone.
Do we have a quorum to do that if people?
If people leave,
How many people can
we
leave?
need 10 people
Okay.
to have a quorum.
Two people?
So 2 people could.
Okay, let's keep it, sorry.
But I just wanted to make you aware of that, so you knew that.
It sounds like folks might have.
Yes,
I'm fine.
I'm
but-
sure, yes, I understand, but I just want to let you all know.
Yeah, sorry, I think we really do have to move on to public comment now then. Yeah, but thank you so much to the panel. Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I wanted to thank the panel, sorry, for really helpful and will really help us moving forward, developing model policies, and we'll probably call on you again in our subcommittee work, so thank you so much.
Thank you again to the panel. So we'll now proceed forward with public comment. Again, asking folks to please make comment, not question. We'll give everyone 2 minutes. Sir?
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is, oh, sure.
We don't have a microphone.
Yes, I do. I have it available for her.
That's what I asked for. Oh, do you want to?
Yeah, so this is not, I'll walk right over to you.
Is that okay?
Yeah, this is what.
My name is Aaron Zisser. I'm the independent police auditor here for the San Jose, for the city of San Jose, and was really glad to be able to hear the great discussions today. Before I give my comment, obviously I'm going to use some of my time to just thank Joyce Hicks, who I worked with as a consultant at the OCC, and Angela Sierra, who I worked with as a consultant at her agency, and most especially Christy Lopez, who was a supervisor of mine at the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. It was really a thrill to hear from you and to see everybody here today. I also want to just acknowledge my outreach coordinator, Talina Barrientos, from our office, the Independent Police Auditor, and thank her. And that's by way of sort of getting to my point, which is one of the things that maybe didn't get emphasized as much about one of the roles of oversight, civilian oversight, is community outreach and engagement. It got touched on, but I just wanted to highlight it. We rely on the community to file complaints, to put pressure on the police department and the city regarding policy changes. So we do a lot of outreach, and we have someone dedicated to coordinate that out of our office, although a number of us do it. And I also just want to, by way of further introducing you to our city, to invite you to touch base with some of those groups that are particularly, we're really lucky in San Jose to have some groups that have national presence, doing work specifically about the impact on families affected by officer-involved shootings in particular, and police violence. And I just want to mention a couple of those. Silicon Valley Debug, which is an activist organization here, and actually has funding to bring together various families, mostly from San Jose, but also from other jurisdictions around Northern California, who have been impacted by police violence. They do extraordinary organizing work, great advocacy led by these families. And they sort of operate as a support system for one another too. And I would invite you to touch base with the group. They have a national presence in other criminal justice reform issues and really outstanding leadership. The one other group I'll mention is, if I could just for a second, is Uncle Bobby Cephas Johnson, who's Oscar Grant's uncle, and is convening a group of families affected by officer-involved shootings June 28th in Oakland. And again, I would invite you to touch base with him. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The board will recognize our sister.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm the Reverend Rowan Fairgrove, and I just wanted to say that last fall I had occasion to review the police-involved shootings in San Jose for the last 15 years in preparation for lifting up those who had been killed, and there aren't very good records. And so I used the Washington Post database, I used local newspapers, and what I found was that in the initial reporting, the person who is shot by police is always characterized as the suspect, the perpetrator, the gang member, some derogatory, had tattoos, had, some derogatory thing, had a weapon. Every single time they have some derogatory characterization and they say they have a weapon in the newspaper. About 2 weeks later, there's a little tiny story that says, well, they didn't actually have a weapon. And when you talk to the families, like in Debug, the things that they had were things like a vegetable peeler, his tools, including a drywall knife, which was just so scary that the officer shot him. Heaven forbid you should ever work on your house. A drill. One of the young women who was shot by police had a drill in her hand. And I just think, especially in the reporting that you're getting from the police departments, that this notion that everybody they shoot is a perpetrator, a suspect, an evil person, has to be taken into account. And I don't know how we can change that or how we can lift that up, but that's my comment, is I really found that in the aftermath, those initial characterizations were almost never borne out.
First of all, I realize that most of you don't live here, but you are cordially invited to hear the Reverend Dr. Jeff Landis speaking at Covenant Presbyterian Church. We're at 2350 Lee Avenue here in San Jose. I've gone there for 15, 20 years, and it will be 100% scriptural. I think it's important in training the officers that we remember that the supreme law of the land is the Constitution. And the Constitution, of course, says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, it says what it says. Okay, and we know what it says. And it's really kind of humorous when I watch Ted Cruz talk with Dianne Feinstein and wrap her around his little finger, because she knows, and we all know what it says and what it means. And so we should train the officers, okay, to remember this, okay, to remember this. Once again, bears repeating, in the training of the officers, there are two excellent books that they should be aware of, because the mental illnesses, okay, that people are supposedly guilty of, sometimes they do have mental illness, but the two books that I highly recommend that every officer is required to read, by Peter Breggin, Toxic Psychiatry, and his friend who's now deceased, Dr. Benjamin Sav, The Myth of Mental Illness, show that these drugs that many times they're forced to take exacerbate the problem. In other words, most of these crazy people that shoot people, 9 out of 10 times, just go to InfoWars and look it up, that's the best news source we have, are on these psychotropic drugs. They really are. And they're forced to take them a lot of times. This is not right. They're forced to take them. Now, in conclusion, how much time do I have? 15 seconds. Okay, please read the Bible. It's the Word of God. Okay, Jesus died for your sins. He raised the third day for your justification. And, you know, Paul, who used to be a murderer, said, to declare, I say at this time, his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him that believes in Jesus.
Any more public comment? Thank you.
Been with the RIPA board as part of DOJ since the beginning, watched it, loved it. I mean, I'm very, empowered by what I see. I was 40 years, I'm a retired annuitant. I've worked for justice for 40 years around crime prevention. The CHP, Commissioner Spike Helmick, and his public affairs officer worked with me to interview the young man who killed my son 23 years ago. And in that process, it's justice and mercy. It's an opportunity to communicate. And I got a chance to talk to the two presenters before. You have an opportunity in the media, 400 to 500 people write 95% of the television. And the Writers Guild needs information. That's why the two folks with the data, you have an opportunity. The Writers Guild of America puts symposiums on, and the writers have a void. They are not going to do the research, but you have an opportunity to tell the story in a way that the public can understand the paradigm shift. And the thing you're trying to do both internally and externally can be done through the media that we have, but they need data, they need story. So that may be one of the elements of something you could do is I offered it to the other two gentlemen, those stats, and some of that information is powerful, and it will translate into something that millions of people watch. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for your loss.
I'm Gabrielle Antolovich, and I'm the board president here at the Billy DeFrank LGBTQ Community Center, and I totally welcome you all here. We have become much more intersectional with all the issues because really it's all part of the same formula. I'm Australian, and I was one of the researchers that was part of the Royal Commission on Human Relationships. And what we discovered is that the people who are racist tend to be the same people who are sexist, homophobic, and hate everyone except their own selves. And I found that very interesting. So it all comes from the same place, and that's why we all have to work together to look at why are they so much in control of so many of us in terms of their prejudice. So the other point I wanted to make is that for 40 years I worked in substance use prevention, and I went to Denver, Colorado when marijuana became legal, and I asked, can I go to where most of the marijuana collectives are? And they said, oh no, you can't go there. And I said, why? I mean, I already knew. It was a poor neighborhood with mainly people of color, and I pretended to be a stoner so I could go in there and see what was inside. I went undercover. And what happened is they knew something was up, so they would call the collectives further on. So what I did was I started taking photographs of everything. And guess what I saw once I looked at the photographs? There were a lot of tobacco places, a lot of places where you could get cheap alcohol. There was only junk food, no fresh food. You could get tobacco everywhere. And I took this PowerPoint to a state alcohol and drug conference in California. And everyone said, this is exactly like my neighborhood. LA, San Diego, San Jose, everywhere, San Francisco. And what is amazing is that the alcohol, tobacco, and all these other industries, junk food industries, and now the marijuana industry is targeting the same neighborhoods. And what happens is these are poor neighborhoods with a greater concentration of people, greater concentration of people of color, and therefore a greater concentration of police who feel there are more problems here than elsewhere. And therefore this targeting happens. And isn't it interesting, the new administration has cut substance use prevention programs so that we don't see the bigger picture. Anyway, thank you for being here.
Thank you for hosting. Co-chair Guerrero will close us out with initiative final remarks after Shannon.
I guess I'm about to be a member of the public, so
2 minutes, right?
For those of you who don't know, I've managed the board for the last 2 years since we launched you back in July of 2016. It has been really my great honor to manage you for the last 2 years, and I will miss you all. I really very much hope you'll stay in touch, and I really look forward to seeing what you do. I hope that you feel that we have set up a really good foundation for you to move forward and create some real meaningful change in some of these spaces, and developing allyships with all of these incredible experts around the state and around the nation. So thank you. Really, it's very bittersweet for me to leave, and I appreciate you all so much.
Well, on behalf of the RIPA board, Shannon, we thank you for everything that you've done for us, for getting us this far, from launching us to issuing a report and getting us to this final meeting. So we know we won't be saying goodbye because we'll see you at the public comment, right? That would be great. You're still in California, which is great. So I want to thank the members of the public for coming to the meeting, thank the members of the board. We are going to close out, but at the beginning of the meeting, Reverend McBride made a statement about the children and the families who are separated at the border, and then we heard from the public about their shared concern on this issue. And so we have a platform, and we can use it, and I want to propose, actually, Reverend McBride and I together want to propose that we actually issue a statement, and I've drafted a short statement, and it builds on our purpose, and if it's something that you think we can do, then I would welcome a motion to issue this statement, and here it is. The RIPA board is a diverse body made up of law enforcement leaders, civil and human rights leaders, and academic experts in California. One of the core functions of the board is to improve the racial and identity sensitivity of law enforcement in the state, to ensure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Public safety depends on public trust, and that trust is eroded when community members are mistreated. In response to the separation of vulnerable migrant families, many of whom are seeking asylum at the California-Mexico border, the RIPA board expresses concern about this law enforcement tactic. The images of parents being torn from children, and children being housed in caged areas, sleeping on the floor, raise critical questions about potentially insensitive and inhumane treatment that could cause irreparable harm, especially to the children. How some law enforcement treat people directly affects the trust and legitimacy of all law enforcement. If we are to build that trust and that legitimacy, law enforcement must treat all people with dignity and respect.
I would move that we adopt that statement as part of the board's response to this situation.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions? Excellent. All right. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. A question before there's one question.
Point of order, because I'm not just familiar with how the board is set up. I'm familiar with items that aren't on an agenda can't be voted on, and I'm just not sure how that applies. So question for DOJ staff, is that within our purview?
That's not how we've processed.
I think it's discussion of the sort and next steps, and we build in sort of, that we do build that in, and I think that could fall under a next step, and that's a step that the board has decided to take.
And we
Thank you.
we can retake a vote if there's a desire to. Okay, all right. Thank you. We are adjourned.